Okay, everybody. Just give me 1 second here. I actually prematurely started the stream without getting properly set up. So that's my fault. Oops. Okay, that's good enough. I guess. There we go. All right, so I was actually going to tweet out the link here, which is why I didn't want to start quite yet, but I pressed the button on my phone. So you'll have to give me a brief moment. Not that it really matters. Not that you're in a rush. Not that anybody has anything to do right now other than sit around and watch ridiculous live streams because I'm assuming you're probably sick of Netflix. I don't watch Netflix. There's nothing on there that I'm particularly interested in. Um, I'd rather read Congressional Research Service reports. I know that makes me a bizarre individual, but it's nonetheless true. Okay, so um, yeah, like for I don't. Somebody mentions reality is more entertaining than fiction or something to that effect. It's just like we're in the midst of a staggering global pandemic, the political implications of which are massive in ways that are inconceivable. I mean, we have no ability now to comprehend the full scope and enormity of what's going on, not just in the U.S. but worldwide. There's a constant flood of information to process, such that you can't process all of it, even if you spent every single day, every single hour, every single minute attempting to do so. So I don't know. It just feels weird to me on some ill-defined visceral level to be thinking about binging random fictional TV shows on Netflix. I mean, I get it. It's not that I never watch movies or anything, but right now it's just not what I'm sort of geared toward. Right now, I understand if you're living with children or something, and you have to keep them occupied or whatever. If you're just wired differently than me, I'm not putting anybody down. I'm just explaining my frame of mind right now, where it does not compel me in any way to sit and watch some random series on Netflix right now, or whatever your preferred streaming service is. Yeah, somebody from the UK says that reality is infinitely more entertaining than fiction at the moment. I find that to be generally the case, especially since the advent of the Trump era. Obviously, it's ebbed and flowed to some extent, but for the most part, there's been a nonstop deluge of just data and information to absorb that I don't know I would call it entertaining, but it's, I don't know, weirdly invigorating. Partly because everybody has been in a posture of national crisis since 2016 in a way. And so I just find that there are so many aspects of that to engage with all the time that it actually takes, yeah, somebody says captivating or stimulating. Those are probably better words. So when I want to kind of change modes, it takes extra effort for me to adjust so that I can tolerate sitting and watching a movie or reading a novel. I mean, I have sort of forced myself to do it because I think it's actually healthy to change things up so you're not always in the same rhythm. But I admit that I sometimes struggle to do that and can have a bit of tunnel vision, although, given the circumstances, I feel like the tunnel vision is justified. But, your mileage may vary. Anyway, um, Trump finally, after much hand wringing and much delay, invoked a provision of the Defense Production Act. And this is pretty interesting because the Defense Production Act has its origins really in World War II. During World War II, obviously the state, meaning the federal government under Franklin Roosevelt, took vast control over the industrial capacities of the American economy to repurpose those capacities toward the war effort. And that repurposing power was codified in the form of the First and Second War Powers Acts of 1941 and 1942. So it's not as though FDR woke up one day and said, okay, I'm going to commandeer the entire American economy so we can defeat the Nazis in Japan. No, he had to have a legal basis to do so by way of Congress. But once the war ended, those authorities ceased to be as directly applicable. So Harry Truman in 1950, as the Korean War was beginning, said, we need to go and figure out a legislative mechanism to retain the powers that were afforded to the president under those World War II era statutes so that they can be used in the event of an emergency here on out. And that was done in the context of the Korean War, where Harry Truman was saying, we don't have the equipment, we don't have the supplies necessary to fund and sustain the war effort this time. But that was also, it was ever since the this act has been reauthorized and the definitions of its authorities have been expanded. So in the act, and by the way, I got all this, I mean, I've been familiar with the act in the past, but I refreshed my memory recently and read a very informative Congressional Research Service report on the Defense Production Act of 1950, its history, authorities, and considerations for Congress. Conveniently, this latest report was updated on March 2nd, so it's as timely as you could hope for. And if you're like me and you derive some value in reading stuff like this, I will link to it, although I can't imagine there's virtually anyone who will actually read it. Although I can assure you that I did because I'm a bizarre person, as I've freely acknowledged. Okay, so the act grants the president wide latitude, once invoked, to take actions compelling domestic economic activity in service of furthering the national defense. Now, the most obvious context for that to occur in is war, but it's not limited to war. In fact, Congress has subsequently clarified in its many reauthorizations of the act since 1950 that national defense can also be construed to mean a situation in which actions or steps must be undertaken to, quote, prepare for or minimize the effects of a hazard upon the civilian population, to deal with the immediate emergency conditions which would be created by the hazard, and to effectuate emergency repairs to, or the emergency restoration of, vital utilities and facilities destroyed or damaged by the hazard. And now when you use the word hazard, I mean, what does that mean exactly? Well, I mean, we have a pretty strong amount of precedent clarifying what it means. One thing that it could mean, and one thing that is relevant to the purposes of Trump invoking it, is it encompasses recovery from hazards, and hazards can be natural hazards, so a natural disaster. So really what the coronavirus is being interpreted as in legal terms, for the purposes of the invocation of this act, is effectively a natural disaster. Even though it's not a hurricane or an earthquake or wildfires, it's a natural disaster and therefore entitles Trump, per his own telling, to invoke the act. Now, Trump just invoked a relatively narrow provision of this act. I mean, the authorities that it could conceivably afford to him are dramatically wide-ranging. Because, again, remember, the act is meant to preserve the authorities wielded by the president during World War II to manage the economy and further into the war effort. So Trump really could, theoretically, go much, 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 much further. What he's only done is invoked basically Title I of the statute, which enables him to require that a private entity, quote, accept, perform, or prioritize federal government contracts in the context of a national emergency. And in this case, all he's done is impose that requirement on one firm, that being General Motors, to produce ventilators. So basically what General Motors is now required to do legally is to prioritize and perform the contracts that are currently on order from the federal government to produce ventilators. And that's just one company. And that's all Trump's order today applied to. He could issue a far more wide-ranging order that encompassed huge swaths of the American economy. But right now it's relatively narrowly tailored. But it is interesting because, if Trump were the fascist tyrant that so many had claimed he was from the outset, since 2016 or even earlier, then you'd think that he would have been eager to invoke the Defense Production Act as quickly as possible. But he really has dragged his feet. I mean, he had to be begged by Andrew Cuomo and others to do this. And when he finally did do it, like I said, he only invoked it fairly narrowly. Now, it's still significant that he invoked it. And really, if you're one of these conservative, Trump-supporting pundits, like this doofus Clay Travis, who's like a sports talk radio guy who thinks that he has awesome insights into American politics, which basically just entails, mocking politically correct 20-year-olds for going overboard with identity issues and politicizing sports and stuff, which, I mean, fine, if that's your burning passion in life to focus on that stuff, go right ahead. But, this moron was going on rants a few days ago saying, oh my God, the trajectory of coronavirus proves that everything was hysterical and an overreaction. Number one, think about how myopic that statement is. We have one guy, a sports talk radio doofus, I don't know where he's at exactly in the country, but somehow we should believe that guys named Clay, wherever he lives, New Jersey maybe, or I don't know, Texas, they have more information and more insight into the severity of the coronavirus threat than, for example, Modi in India, who locked down the entire country, 1.3 billion people in India. Modi locked down and ordered them to stay indoors. So, is Clay Travis and his fellow doofuses accusing Modi, who I don't think is like a social justice warrior snowflake, are they accusing him of being a hysterical overreactor? Because that's sort of the logical consequence or the logical extension of what they're arguing. And somebody's in this chat right now waving from lockdown in India. Hello. share some insights into how that's working, if you're interested. Um, you know, is Boris Johnson a social justice warrior, pansy, snowflake, wuss? Because he too has issued a nationwide lockdown order for the UK and has himself contracted coronavirus, as he just admitted today. There's almost no way in hell that Boris Johnson is the only world leader who actually has coronavirus. Somehow, mysteriously, the wives of other world leaders have contracted coronavirus, but not the actual leaders, like in Spain, Canada. I mean, Bolsonaro, pretty tested positive for coronavirus, and then they tried to lie about it and cover it up. He was in direct proximity to Trump. I still think there's a very good possibility that Trump was himself a carrier of coronavirus, even if he didn't get gravely ill from it. Which means he could have spread it to others theoretically by shaking their hands and, just breathing on them. But anyway, the point is, if you're going to maintain this posture of, oh my God, the snowflakes and the hysterics are overreacting, then by extension, you also got to now be accusing Trump of overreacting, because he took some relatively dramatic action today to force a private entity to comply with government dictates in the interest of national security or national defense as it relates to coronavirus. So, if you're still of that mindset, then you therefore have to be accusing Trump of overreacting and being a hysterical pansy wuss. Because even though it was a relatively narrow invocation of the Defense Production Act, it was an invocation nonetheless, and he could potentially broaden it out later on. So, another interesting component of this is the enforcement mechanisms. That's unclear to me, even though I did read this Congressional Research Service report. Like, hypothetically, say GM refuses to comply with the order. Like, what's the penalty there? That's unclear to me. I guess it would fall into the purview of the Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, who actually is the one delegated authority to oversee this order, because there are provisions where the authority gets delegated after the president issues the order. Authority gets delegated to cabinet secretaries. But this is, it's not entirely clear what would happen in the event of a refusal to comply. I can't imagine GM would actually refuse to comply, but it's interesting to contemplate the hypothetical. But yeah, if Trump were this fascist menace who was like power hungry and had these extreme authoritarian ambitions, then why wouldn't he have invoked the act right away? And why wouldn't he have done a more wide-ranging invocation of the act? It seems rather that he's fairly hesitant to assume control of sectors of the economy. Because he's probably listening to the more free marketeer people around him, and like just your average Republicans who think that asserting authority over aspects of economic activity would contravene their free market conception of what the Republican Party is. Maybe it would spook Wall Street. Maybe it would not be good for the markets. Whatever the argument may be, those people definitely have influence over Trump. But, the fact that he had to be sort of pressured and cajoled into it, I think, militates against the notion of him being just this crazed, fanatical, tyrant, fascistic menace. Like, an irony is if Trump actually were a committed fascist, not that would be good. That would be extremely dangerous in many ways, don't get me wrong. But for the purposes of curbing and containing a pandemic, a fascist probably would have done a more competent job than Trump. So this definitely cuts against the notion of Trump being a fascist, but not being a fascist is kind of a low bar. If you say that Trump is not a fascist, it doesn't mean that you're also saying he is therefore good. It just means whatever harms he's inflicting are not a result of him being a fascist. They're a result of him being other things. I know people maybe need to think about it for 2 seconds to wrap their minds around that formulation I just laid out, but ponder it and meditate on it for a while. Maybe go for a walk in the park while maintaining social distance and try to wrap your mind around what I just laid out there. Because I think reasonably intelligent people, or even unintelligent people, should be able to grasp that logic. Um, yeah, in other news, I mean, the House passed by voice vote, so essentially by unanimous consent. It's the $2+ trillion relief bill this afternoon, without a single formal vote being lodged against it. Now, what happened was Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky attempted to force a roll call vote. Means that the bill would have obviously passed anyway, but he attempted to force a roll call vote and make everybody officially vote so that it would be inserted into the congressional record and we can know who voted for this bill and who voted against it. But he failed to get anybody to second his demand for a roll call vote, and so it never happened, and they just passed it by a voice vote. So, formally, nobody in either chamber of Congress, so that's 535 members, nobody voted against this bill, which is unbelievable. I mean, it's 2.4 trillion. That's the official tally. Let me just make sure I have that right. $2.2 trillion, somewhere in that ballpark. Um, that's only the official tally. It doesn't take into account the lending power given to the Federal Reserve, which some people are saying could make the true cost of the bill as much as 6 trillion or even 10 trillion. So don't call this a relief bill, because guess what? Anybody remember TARP from 2008? I was a younger person back then, but I remember. It was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program. So it had the word relief in there. But who was getting the relief? It was the banks. It was the financial institutions. Who's getting the, quote, relief this time? Again, Wall Street. Different elements of Wall Street, but Boeing, the weapons manufacturer, snuck in through their corporate lobbyist efforts a very sweetheart carve-out. So they get a multi-billion-dollar bailout. And all their corporate malfeasance of the past several years gets washed away because of a pandemic. I don't know what the hell the failure of their airplane models or other aspects of their corporate mismanagement has to do with a pandemic. Like there's nothing, no connection to coronavirus. Because of coronavirus, they get to say, oh, we're this critical, we're critical to the national interest, and therefore we need a bailout. And they got it. And nobody voted against it. Not anybody. Not Bernie. Not Elizabeth Warren. Not anybody. Not even Rand Paul and Mike Lee, because they were quarantined. Now, the House vote's a little different because they just need a quorum. So not even everybody was there. And some are sick with coronavirus. So, it's unclear to me whether Tulsi even made it back from Hawaii in time to vote, because she had to travel farther than anybody. as of the latest count, it does not appear that she made it back in time, because there's a Google Doc that reporters from the roll call publication were keeping, uh, showing which House members were present for the vote, because you only needed half in order to actually have the vote, uh, and does not appear that she made it. Um, but yeah, none of them were even given an opportunity to vote against it because of the way this was maneuvered by the congressional leadership in both chambers. So this is all about Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader. They orchestrated this entire thing. So what individual senators or members of the House did was almost immaterial. It had no impact, meaningfully. This was an opportunity for the bipartisan leadership in both houses to push through something without getting anybody on the record to state their approval or disapproval of it. At least in the House. I mean, they got it through so quickly in such a way that everybody pretty much has plausible deniability for any responsibility for it. Like, nobody's actually on the record in the House as having voted for it. So when the ineptitude of this and the corruption of it becomes clear, when it's abundantly obvious later on, maybe weeks from now, months from now, years from now, decades from now, when that becomes abundantly clear and we can actually analyze what was in this bill, because nobody could really read it fully yet, meaning read it with enough sophistication where they can understand the true implications. I mean, that was impossible. So when all that becomes clear down the line, there's nobody to really hold accountable for it, except, I guess, Schumer, Pelosi, McConnell, and McCarthy. And they could just say, oh, it was a national emergency, we had to do it. Sorry. And, Thomas Massie got a huge backlash for trying to force a roll call vote because they were saying, oh, it was dangerous because he was forcing members to return to Congress. Now, in fairness, that probably was kind of dangerous in the sense that I wouldn't be surprised now if more members of Congress contract coronavirus as a result of that. Because even though they were trying to maintain social distancing in the House chamber, they still had to come and attend a mass gathering, which is not advisable. And there were at least 9 members of the New York congressional delegation, not just New York, but members of Congress from New York City and Long Island, who were there physically in the chamber today. And that's probably not smart of them, given that New York City is the epicenter. And the epicenter is now going outwards from New York City to Nassau County. We already knew that Westchester was a smaller scale epicenter. It's probably coming to New Jersey. New Jersey has the second most cases in the country now, second to behind New York. And by the way, people in New York and New Jersey travel lots of places throughout the country, so don't think that if you live someplace else, you're necessarily protected from this. People go to Florida, people go to Pennsylvania, people go to California, people go everywhere. But I'd be curious to know if the following members from the New York City and Long Island who are in the House today are carriers of coronavirus. Have they gotten tested? Because as we all know, you can be asymptomatic for up to 14 days. Yvette Clarke, Hakeem Jeffries, Gregory Meeks, Grace Meng, Nydia Velasquez, Thomas Swazi, Peter King, Max Rose, and of course everybody's favorite, AOC. They all were in Congress today physically. So we'll see what happens with that. But it's just incredible that our system of government allowed for the biggest corporate bailout in U.S. history to be rushed through under emergency pretenses in a matter of days with not a single officially recorded dissenting vote. It's amazing. I would love for the quote American exceptionalist to explain how that makes our system of government superior to everyone else's in the world. And no, Bernie's fake grandstanding that caused his Twitter followers, who are now becoming more like cultists, to erupt into elation, it was fake. It didn't actually achieve anything. That was all the leadership. It was procedural arcana that amounted to zip, and yet it gave Bernie an opportunity to give this rousing floor address and make it seem as though it actually accomplished something, which it didn't. Only thing it accomplished was to scintillate his online echo chamber. So that's where we're at. I don't know what to say anymore. We're all at home, maintaining our social distance. I feel very socially distant from many people in our government at the moment. I feel socially distant on multiple levels, including figurative levels as well as literal ones. Let me see if I have any super chats to respond to. I don't. That's appalling. How dare you? One thing I'm going to do later tonight is I'm going to revisit asking. I made an offer 2 days ago to speak to anybody offline who feels like they're in a stressful situation, who feels anxious, afraid, lonesome, whatever. If I feel like they want somebody to talk to, I will do that offline. And I got flooded with requests from people who wanted to talk. And so I talked to two people when I first put out that request who were in a difficult predicament. And you know what? It's actually mutually beneficial. They seem like they got something out of it. I feel like I'm contributing in a small way. And so I'm going to try to do that semi-regularly for as long as this emergency scenario is underway. And I'm going to do it again tonight, shortly after ending the stream. So if you're interested in that, then, maybe I'll do it. Somebody says, do a call-in show. That would be funny. I have to figure that out logistically. But in principle, I'm in favor of that. 1-800 Cool Guy MT. That's would be the call-in line. All right. Happy trails, everybody.